The document on the table was not a document so much as a verdict, and it lay between them the way a blade might lie, flat and patient, and entirely indifferent to the hand that would eventually lift it. Outside the solicitor's tall windows, November pressed its gray face against the glass, and the coals in the grate had burned down to something the color of old rust. The Duke of Ashmore sat at the head of the long table. His secretary stood to his left. 3 solicitors occupied the far end in the arrangement that forms itself when men of lesser authority instinctively cluster away from power. And no one had decided this. No one had needed to. Cordelia sat opposite the Duke with her hands folded on the surface before her and her carpet bag positioned at her feet with the particular neatness of a person who has packed it many times in many cold rooms and has learned that order, where it can be imposed, should be. She did not cross her ankles. She did not look at the window. She looked at the document, and then she looked at the Duke, and he was already looking at her with the expression of a man reviewing something he has not yet decided is worth reviewing. His name was Julian Ashmore, the 4th Duke of that title, and he was younger than the title suggested, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the quality of stillness that in some men grows from discipline, and in others, from a kind of long, cold certainty that the world will arrange itself to their satisfaction. In his case, it appeared to be both. "You come recommended," he said. He did not inflect it as a compliment. "By Mr. Hatfield," she said. "Hatfield is retired." "He is. He recommended me before he retired." A pause ran its course. The secretary made a small note. One of the solicitors, the one nearest the window whose name was Pell, allowed himself a brief smile of the sort that announces it is not a smile at all but merely the face settling into its natural arrangement. "The inventory of the Ashmore East Wing," Julian said, "and its contents. The wing sustained fire damage 3 years past and has been sealed. The contents require cataloguing before the property can be formally assessed for the estate sale." "I understand," Cordelia said. "The previous appraiser left the work incomplete." "He did, and the one before him." The Duke's gaze sharpened by 1 degree, the particular sharpening of a man who has noted something he did not expect to hear named. "There were scheduling difficulties," Pell offered from his end of the table, still in the vicinity of that particular smile. Cordelia did not look at Pell. She looked at Julian. "I will need unrestricted access to the wing, and to all prior documentation, inventories, acquisition records, insurance schedules, whatever exists." "Whatever exists will be made available," Julian said, with the inflection of a man for whom the phrase has a narrow and carefully managed meaning. "Then I will begin Monday," she said. She reached forward and drew the contract toward her, uncapped her pen, and signed her name in the clean, small hand of someone who signs documents that matter without announcing that they do. Julian watched this. He would spend considerably longer than he anticipated watching the way Cordelia did things, and he would not, for a very long time, be able to say precisely why. What he told himself, in the carriage on the way home, was that she was composed to a degree he found faintly suspicious. What it was, in truth, was that her stillness was not the stillness of meekness. It was the stillness of someone who already knew the shape of the room. "I am glad you have stayed this long. This is a story about a woman who is given access to a burned place and finds it holds more truth than the men around her intended. It is about the particular courage of someone who does nothing loudly and changes everything anyway. Tell me in the comments whether that kind of patience makes sense to you, or whether you find it difficult to understand." The east wing of Ashmore Hall stood at the end of a stone corridor that smelled of cold soot and old plaster, and when Cordelia first pushed open its outer door on the Monday morning as promised, the light that entered with her was the thin, horizontal light of a November mid-morning that illuminates without warming. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, and took stock in the manner of someone who has learned that the first act of attention, performed slowly, saves a considerable amount of error later. The wing had been grand. Even ruin has a grammar, and the grammar of this ruin spoke of high ceilings, of plasterwork cornices now sagged and darkened, of a floor-to-ceiling bookcase along the north wall from which the fire had eaten the upper two shelves and left the lower four with a frosting of ash across their spines that preserved, ironically, the titles of the volumes that had survived. A writing desk of burled walnut stood against the far wall, its leather surface warped by heat and water both. Chairs, a sofa, a side table, a vitrine of the kind used for displaying small precious objects, its glass cracked through the center in a single diagonal line like a signature. Cordelia set her bag on the cleanest available surface, which was a windowsill, and withdrew her notebook and her ruled sheets for condition reports, and her own seal, a small brass instrument she used to mark her working copies so that they could not later be mistaken for anything other than what they were, a primary working record in the hand of the practitioner of record. She began at the door and moved clockwise, as she always did, cataloging on a provenance assessment sheet the location, description, estimated period, and visible condition of each object. The walnut desk she dated provisionally to the first quarter of the preceding century by the character of its brasswork and the particular curve of its apron. The vitrine held, behind its cracked glass, a collection of silver vinaigrettes, 6 in number, their gilding largely intact beneath a surface deposit of smoke residue that a careful hand and the right solvent could address. She noted this without yet touching them, because the rule she had made for herself in the first months of her training and never once violated was that observation precedes handling. She had learned this from a woman, not a man, and she had kept the lesson longer than she had kept most things from that period of her life. By noon she had worked through the first of what she estimated would be 12 to 15 sessions. She had found, in the course of that morning, 4 objects whose condition reports she marked with a small asterisk, meaning that their stated provenance, as recorded on the labels attached to them, did not align with the physical evidence of the objects themselves. A silver-mounted tortoiseshell box bore a label reading 1741 in a hand she did not recognize from the estate's acquisition records, but the hallmarks on the silver mounts, which she examined with the small loop she kept on a cord at her wrist, indicated a manufacture date no earlier than the 1790s. This was not necessarily sinister. Mislabeling in large private collections accumulated over generations was common, sometimes innocent, sometimes not. She asterisked it and moved on. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Gale, brought tea at 12:30 without being asked. She set it on the windowsill beside Cordelia's bag with the efficiency of someone performing a duty rather than an act of warmth. And then she paused at the door with the slightly arrested quality of a person who has something to say and has decided against saying it. "It is a great deal of work for one person," Mrs. Gale said at last. "It is the correct amount of work for this person," Cordelia said, without looking up from her condition sheet. Mrs. Gale's pause continued for another 3 seconds, which was long enough to constitute consideration, and then she left. Cordelia drank the tea standing up, looking out at the winter garden below, where dead flower stalks stood in rows with the patient, formal arrangement of things that have given up but have not yet been cleared away. She thought, briefly, of a garden not so very different from this one. Then she finished her tea, set the cup down with a small, precise sound, and returned to work. The wing gave nothing away, but it gave her time, and she had always known what to do with time. To understand what Cordelia brought to that burned and silent wing, it is necessary to go back 11 years, to a house in Wiltshire that no longer exists in the form it held then, and to a woman named Agnes Forsyth who did. The story cannot go forward until it has gone back, and so it goes back now. Cordelia's father was a country solicitor of moderate skill and immoderate ambition, and when she was 14 he apprenticed her informally, and with no particular intention, to Agnes Forsyth, the foremost independent appraiser of estate contents in the southwest of England, on the grounds that Agnes was a family friend who needed a girl to run errands, and that Cordelia was demonstrably too clever to be simply domestic. Agnes was 61, small, spare, with the dry economy of movement that comes from decades of handling things that did not belong to her and putting them down without damage. She wore her gray hair in a plain coil, and she had a habit of removing her spectacles to look at something important, as though clarity of vision required the absence of the instrument designed to provide it. She accepted Cordelia into her workrooms on a Monday in February, looked at her for 30 seconds and said, "The first thing I will teach you is hallmarking. The second is how to read a condition report without being deceived by it. The third is what it means when an object is not where it should be." In the 11 years between that February and the November morning when Cordelia signed Julian Ashmore's contract, she had acquired, under Agnes's direct instruction and then in practice of her own, a thorough command of silver hallmarks and what they indicated and what they concealed, of the identifying characteristics of furniture by period and maker, of the particular vocabulary of condition reports and how the same phrase, showing minor surface wear, meant 4 different things depending on who had written it and what they had to gain, of the weight and feel of old glass versus new, and of the taxonomy of estate documents, their cross-referencing, their regular patterns and their irregular ones. She had also acquired, in the same period, the knowledge of what it meant to lose the person who had taught her all of this. Agnes Forsyth died in the spring of the 8th year, quietly, in the chair beside her workroom fire, with a condition report in her hands that she had been annotating. The pen had left a small mark on the paper at the moment of its involuntary dropping, a mark Cordelia saw when she found her, and which she could not afterwards think of without a steadiness that cost her something each time. Agnes left her the workroom, the instruments, a collection of 12 reference volumes, and, in a codicil added 3 months before her death, her copy of the standard hallmarking tables with the following, written in the margin of the first page in Agnes's thin, firm hand: "The object cannot lie. The person presenting it can. Learn the difference before the room does." It was this principle, as much as any technical skill, that Cordelia carried into every estate she entered, every burned room, every ledger whose figures arranged themselves in patterns that only made sense if someone had wanted them not to. She had encountered falsified records before, twice, in houses smaller than Ashmore Hall, and in amounts considerably smaller than she would eventually find here. What she had not yet encountered was a falsification of the particular systematic patience that she would find in the Ashmore East Wing, or the particular quality of man who had overseen it, or the particular quality of other man who had not known it was happening, and had been so completely certain he did not need to know. The village of Ashmore Parva sat at the bottom of the estate's southern slope like something a child had set down and not picked up again, and when Cordelia walked into it for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon, having gone to find a reliable saddler's shop that might supply her with the waxed linen thread she used to rebind document folders, whose original bindings had deteriorated, she found instead something she had also encountered before, which was the specific quality of silence that falls when a stranger walks through a door, and the people already inside make a collective, unspoken decision to continue their conversations at a slightly altered angle. The ironmonger's shop served also, it appeared, as a kind of informal exchange for information and opinion among the village's men of middle age, and when Cordelia entered it and asked for waxed linen thread, the man behind the counter, whose name she would learn was Fowler, said he did not carry it. She asked whether there was another merchant. He said the nearest was 12 miles. She thanked him and turned to go. "You'll be the one at the hall," said a voice from the corner of the room, and when she turned, she found the voice belonging to a man who was seated in a way that suggested he had been seated in that corner for a very long time, possibly longer than anyone could accurately recall, with a mug of something warm between his hands and the physical diminishment of considerable age and the eyes of someone for whom diminishment has not reached the interior. His name, she would learn, was Tobias Crane. He was 81 and had been the estate's head carpenter for 34 years before his hands made it impossible. And he had lived in the village all his life, and he watched things the way a person watches things when they have decided that watching is the most useful contribution they can still make. "I am," she said. "You'll be after the East Wing." "I will." He nodded, slowly, in the manner of someone confirming an expectation rather than receiving information. "Third one," he said. "Third appraiser?" "Third." He lifted the mug, set it down, looked at her. "The first two were men," she observed. "They were," he said, "and they both found the work incomplete and left it. Found other things too, I shouldn't wonder." He said this with the flat directness of someone who has outlasted enough social refinement to dispense with its requirements. Cordelia sat in the empty chair across from him, which she calculated was a small signal worth sending. "What should I know?" she asked. "That no one will tell me." He looked at her for a long time, during which Fowler behind the counter kept his back very deliberately turned. "The wing burned in the 3rd year of Pell's management of the estate accounts," Crane said, "and nobody asked why it burned in the 3rd year and not the 1st. He picked up his mug again and said nothing further. It was enough. Cordelia walked back up the slope to the hall in the early dark of the November afternoon, and she thought about the solicitor named Pell, with his particular smile, and she thought about the fact that when she had asked for prior documentation of the East Wing's contents, what had arrived on her work table was a single ledger covering the past 4 years, with no documentation at all predating the fire. She had noted this without commenting on it. She noted it again now, with more weight. She had 3 more full weeks of preliminary assessment before the holidays would interrupt the work. She used all of them. The days shortened and the frost came, and Cordelia worked through both. By the 3rd week of November, she had completed her preliminary condition survey of the East Wing's accessible contents, which amounted to 47 discrete items assessed and logged on provenance assessment sheets in her close, economical hand, and 14 more marked with her asterisk for second review. The asterisked objects had in common a quality that she had begun, privately and carefully, to characterize in her working notes as inconsistency of provenance narrative, which was a technical phrase meaning that what the labels said and what the objects told, in the language of hallmarks and tool marks and the period-specific characteristics of construction and finish, that no forger patient enough to change a label was ever quite patient enough to also change, were not the same story. A bracket clock of 8-day movement with a case she assessed as late 17th century bore a label indicating a gift to the estate in 1803. The movement's wheel cutting, examined under her loupe, was consistent with the earlier date. This was not in itself evidence of falsification. It was consistent with the clock's earlier history simply being misdocumented. What made it interesting was that it was the same error, in the same direction, as 6 other objects she had assessed. In every case, the label's date was later than the object's physical evidence indicated, and in every case the date on the label was after the fire. She had found, in the 4th week, the first document that made the pattern visible. It was not in the East Wing but in the muniments room, to which she had been granted access following a request submitted in writing to Julian's secretary and approved after 3 days' interval, and what she found there, in a box labeled Estate Correspondence, 1848 to 1853, was a letter of acquisition for a silver-gilt inkstand attributed to a maker of the 2nd decade of the 18th century, sold to the estate by a dealer named Croft of Bristol, for the sum of £42. The inkstand was in her East Wing inventory, asterisked. Its hallmarks, which she had examined on her first day in the wing, indicated a manufacturer active between 1710 and 1728. The letter of acquisition was dated 1854, the year after the fire, and had been filed, with commendable tidiness, in the box that covered the preceding 6 years, which was the box in which it had no business being. She had not yet said this to anyone. She had photographed the letter with the small portable apparatus she used for documentary evidence, and she had made a transcription in her notebook in her own hand, and she had replaced it in its incorrect position with the precision of someone who intends to leave all things exactly as she found them, because the day on which it would matter that she had found it had not yet arrived. What she had also found in the same box was a second letter in a different hand, this one addressed not to the estate but to a name she did not recognize, a Mr. Desmond Achebe of London, and referencing payment outstanding on the arrangement, and this was enough to make her understand that what she was looking at was not a disorganized collection but an organized one, and that the disorganization was in the paperwork and the paperwork was intentional. She worked through the long December evenings in the wing, going back through the physical survey with the new information, reassessing each asterisked item against what she now knew, rather than what she had suspected, and the picture that accumulated across her ruled sheets was thorough, specific, and, in the flat technical vocabulary of the discipline, damning. She mentioned none of this to Julian Ashmore, whom she saw at a distance 3 times during these weeks, once crossing the stable yard, once at the end of the long corridor when she was coming out of the muniments room, and once at a formal distance, at a brief interview in which he asked whether the work was proceeding, and she said it was. "On schedule?" he asked. "Thoroughly," she said. He looked at her with that sharpened quality again. He seemed, she thought, to be waiting for something, without knowing what he was waiting for. She was not yet ready to tell him. January came, and with it the thing that changed the quality of the air between Cordelia and Julian Ashmore, from the polite indifference of employer and specialist to something considerably harder to categorize. She had sent, in the first week of the new year, a formal request through his secretary for a meeting to discuss the status of the inventory, and on a Wednesday morning of frost and white light, she was shown into his study and found him already standing at the window with his hands behind his back, looking out at the ice-locked garden with the expression of a man who does not particularly enjoy the view, but has not yet found a reason to turn from it. He turned when she entered. He did not offer her a seat. She sat anyway, taking the chair nearest the fire, which was the sensible choice and which she suspected he noticed. She opened her notebook on the table and placed beside it, with a neatness she did not feel the need to make theatrical, her preliminary provenance summary, 4 pages of her ruled hand, with the column for assessed value on the right, and the column for documentary provenance on the left, and between them the column she had titled Provenance Consistency, which was populated by one of 3 entries, verified, unverified, or inconsistent. He came to the table. He looked at the pages. He looked at her. "These 14 objects," he said. "Yes, their provenance is listed as inconsistent. It is. Meaning that the physical evidence of the objects and the documentary record do not agree." Julian was quiet for a long moment, with the quality of someone in whom the cognitive rearrangement of received information is a controlled and private process. "What kind of disagreement?" he said. "In every case," Cordelia said, "the documentary record assigns the object a date, a provenance, or an acquisition circumstance that the physical evidence contradicts. In every case, the discrepancy is in the same direction. The documents are later than the objects." He picked up the sheet. He read it. She watched his hands. He was a man who did not read quickly for show, which was more interesting than she had expected. "You believe the documentation was altered," he said. It was not a question. "I believe the documentation was created," she said, "after the fact, after the fire." The silence this time was of a different quality than any previous silence between them. It was the silence of a significant weight setting itself down in the center of a room, and both of them feeling the floor shift beneath it. "Pell administers the estate," Julian said, without inflection. "He has for 7 years," Cordelia said. "He administered it for 3 years before the fire." Julian put the sheet down. He walked back to the window. He stood there for what she counted internally as 12 seconds, which in a room of that silence was a very considerable interval. "Continue the work," he said, without turning. "I intend to," she said. She gathered her papers, capped her pen, stood, and walked to the door. She had her hand on the handle when he spoke again. "The previous 2 appraisers," he said. "Neither raised this." She turned. "No," she said, "they did not." She left him to the window and the white garden, and she felt, as she walked the long corridor back to the east wing with her notebook under her arm and the frost pressing at every window she passed, that what had just shifted between them was not yet nameable, and that she was content to let it remain that way until it was ready to be named. What she discovered in the second week of February, in the company of no one but the cold and the particular silence of a room that had held its secret for 7 years, was the account book. It was not where an account book should be. It was where a person hides something they need to retrieve periodically, which is to say not far, which is to say in a place that looks like furniture. The east wing's surviving bookcase, lower 4 shelves, north wall, contained at its far left end what appeared, on survey, to be a run of uniformly bound estate journals, identical in their dark cloth covers and their gilt spine lettering. Cordelia had assessed them on day 2 of her work and logged them as estate household journals, circa 1830 to 1852, low individual value, assessed collectively. She had not opened each individual volume on that first pass, because they were uniform and their spines were legible, and the work on that day had needed to go faster. She opened each individual volume now. The 31st volume in the sequence was not a household journal. It was a payment record in a hand she had seen before, in that incorrectly filed letter of acquisition. It covered a period of 41 months, from 8 months before the fire to 33 months after it, and it recorded, in that careful, clerical hand, a series of payments made against a series of entries, described as clearance and replacement, and each entry was cross-referenced to a numbered object, and the numbered objects mapped. When she sat down at the walnut desk with her own inventory open beside this book and worked through it line by line over the course of a very long afternoon, onto the asterisk items in her survey with a completeness that made her put down her pen and sit still for a moment in the way a person sits still when they have found what they were looking for, and must acknowledge to themselves what finding it means. What it meant was this: the East Wing fire, whether or not it had been deliberately set, had been used as the occasion for a systematic replacement of genuine estate objects with later, lesser substitutes. The originals had been removed, their provenance documentation retained, and the documentation reassigned to the substitutes. The difference in value, calculated on the basis of her own assessments, and the figures recorded in the account book in what appeared to be a consistently accurate hand, was very considerable. Over 41 months, by Cordelia's initial estimate, the scheme had transferred approximately £2,800 from the Ashmore estate to the unnamed parties referenced only as the arrangement. The estate, in the same period, had recorded no anomaly in its accounts, because the accounts were administered by Pell, who was the same man who had filed the acquisition letter in the wrong box, the same man who had provided her with a ledger beginning only 4 years previously, the same man whose smile, when she had asked for documentation in November, had occupied the category of things that are performed rather than felt. She photographed every page of the account book. She made a full transcription. She replaced the volume in its position in the shelf, between its identical neighbors, and she sat at the desk until the light in the wing failed completely, and there was nothing left to see by. Then she gathered her things and walked up through the cold house to find Julian Ashmore. "The object cannot lie," Agnes Forsyth had written in the margin of the hallmarking tables. She had found the object. Now she had to find the man. What followed the finding was not dramatic, which was fitting, because what Cordelia had found was not the raw material of drama, but the raw material of procedure. And procedure is the thing that drama pretends does not exist. She brought her notebook, her transcribed copies, her photographic reproductions, and her completed provenance assessment to Julian's study on a Thursday evening in late February, and she laid them on his table in the order in which they told their story. The inconsistent provenance sheets first, then the acquisition letter from the wrong box, then the transcription of the account book with her annotations in the margin, and then, last, her own consolidated figure, written at the bottom of a clean sheet in her small hand, 2,840 pounds, minimum, over 41 months, not including the value of provenance documentation removed or destroyed. Julian read everything. He read slowly. He did not speak until the last sheet was returned to the table, and then what he said was, "This is conclusive. It is documentary and physical evidence in alignment," she said. "It requires independent audit to constitute legal proof. But you have no doubt, none." He put both hands flat on the table and looked at the papers for a moment longer. Then he looked at her, and there was nothing in his face that resembled the expression with which he had reviewed her in November, the expression of a man assessing something he had not yet decided was worth his attention. What was in his face instead was something considerably more difficult to produce in a man of his disposition, which was the unguarded recognition that he had been badly wrong and that he was looking at someone who had been quietly, thoroughly, and without any fanfare whatsoever, right. "I relied on Pell for the accounting of this estate for 7 years, he said. "You did," she said. It was not an accusation. It was, in her delivery, simply a fact, delivered in the same register as all her other facts, without adornment, and without mercy, and without cruelty, which was the register of accuracy. "The previous appraisers," he said, "if Pell knew they were coming, and he would have known, he had time to manage what they saw." She nodded once. "And you?" "I asked for documents that made their absence visible," she said. "And I asked only once, so that the shape of what was withheld was also informative." He was quiet. She allowed the quiet to exist. "What do you require to proceed?" he said. "A letter from you to the relevant authorities in London. I can draft it if you prefer. The account book remains in the wing, in its position, until the investigators require it. I will provide them with the transcription and the photographic copies. And Pell should not be informed." He looked at her. "You think he would destroy evidence? I think he would try," she said. "I think he has been sufficiently careful to leave himself alternatives, and that we should not provide him the occasion to use them." Julian straightened. He was quiet for another interval. Then he said, with the control of a man who has just reorganized a very significant internal structure, "You have been at this work since November." "I have, and you said nothing until you were certain." "That is the work," she said. She capped her pen. The letter was sent the following morning, drafted in Cordelia's hand and signed in Julian's. And 3 weeks after that, on a cold afternoon in March, 2 men arrived from London with the authority and the disposition for precisely this kind of investigation, and they sat with Cordelia for 4 hours in the East Wing, working through her evidence, and she answered their questions with the same quality of accuracy she had brought to everything else, which was to say completely, precisely, and without editorializing. Pell was notified by letter on a Friday in April. The letter was from the estate solicitors, a different firm than his own, and it outlined the nature of the evidence and the requirement for a formal accounting. He attended the meeting in the manner of a man who has spent the interval calculating his options and has found them fewer than expected. The smile was not in attendance. The reckoning, when it completed itself, did so in the administrative way of things that are thorough, through a series of meetings, a series of documents, a detailed audit conducted by independent accountants who spent 6 weeks in the muniments room and emerged with a figure somewhat larger than Cordelia's initial estimate, which was £3,120, covering a period of 41 months, attributed to a scheme in which Pell had acted in collaboration with the dealer Croft of Bristol, and the man named Desmond Achebe who had, it emerged, served as the intermediary in the resale of the original objects through a network of London dealers, sufficiently distant from one another that the pattern was not visible from any single point within it. It was visible from Cordelia's ruled sheets, which were entered into the formal record as primary evidentiary documentation. Pell did not contest the documentary evidence. He sat through the formal meeting in Julian's library in the company of his own solicitor and a hired accountant, and he said the minimum required of him, and he signed the documents required of him, and he was gone from the estate's affairs before the end of April. He had not looked at Cordelia during the proceedings. She had not required him to. The frightened figure in this affair was not Pell, who was not frightened but merely reduced, the smile finally exhausted of its usefulness, but rather Mr. Harlow, Julian's estate secretary, who had been Pell's contemporary and colleague, and who had, it was established, known nothing of the scheme, but had known that something was irregular, and had made the particular calculation, available to men in positions of moderate comfort, that silence was cheaper than inquiry. Harlow was not prosecuted. He was, however, moved to a less consequential position within the estate's affairs, and he received this with a kind of deflated relief that Cordelia observed without comment, because she understood it. Understanding a thing was not the same as absolving it, but it was the thing she was capable of in his case, and she offered it without ceremony. What she did not offer, and what Julian offered her in June, in the garden that had been cleared of its dead stalks, and now held the early green of things beginning again, was a continuation of the work, formally commissioned, to complete the catalogue of the wing's undamaged contents, and oversee the restoration of its documentation to accuracy. She accepted. She had known she would accept from the moment he proposed it, and the moment he proposed it had come while they were standing in the east wing, looking at the wall where the bookcase stood, and he had picked up, from the table beside him, the silver-mounted tortoiseshell box with its incorrect label, and he had said, quite quietly, without looking at her, "How does one know, from the object alone, how old it is?" And she had told him, in the plain vocabulary of hallmarks and construction and the evidence available to a trained eye and a steady hand, and he had listened with the full attention of someone who is learning something they had not expected to find important. And when she finished, he had said nothing for a moment, and then he had said, "Continue," and it was both a request about the explanation and something larger and less easily categorized, and she had continued. Tobias Crane, in his corner of the ironmonger's shop, said when he heard the outcome, "Third time was the right time." He did not elaborate. Cordelia heard it from Mrs. Gale, who had finally stopped delivering tea with the efficiency of duty and had begun delivering it with something closer to goodwill, and when she heard it, she thought of Agnes Forsyth's marginal inscription and understood that it was its own kind of aphorism, and that Crane had earned the right to one. The object cannot lie. The person presenting it can. Learn the difference before the room does. She had learned it a long time ago, in a workroom in Wiltshire beside a small woman who removed her spectacles to see what mattered most clearly. She had carried it here. The East Wing reopened, formally and quietly, in the following October, 1 year to the month after Cordelia had first pushed open its outer door with her carpet-bag at her feet and the horizontal November light entering with her. The restoration had been overseen by a conservator from London, and by Cordelia herself, who had specified the treatment requirements for each affected object in terms of its material composition and the nature of the damage sustained, and the result was not a wing made new, but a wing made honest, its scorch marks and its history both visible and accounted for. The walnut desk had been stabilized rather than refinished, because the history of a surface, as Agnes had taught, is part of the surface's value, and erasure of evidence is never improvement. The vitrine's glass had been replaced, but the original cracked pane was stored flat in the conservation records along with Cordelia's photographs of it in situ, because the record was the record and the record was not permitted to have gaps anymore. Julian walked through the wing on the morning before the formal reopening with Cordelia beside him, and he said very little, which was his manner, and she said very little, which was hers, and the quality of their shared silence was entirely different from every silence that had existed between them before, which is the thing that happens when two people have spent a year being honest in the same direction. At the doorway, going out, he stopped and turned and looked at the room with its restored and accurately documented contents, and he said, "You knew in November when you signed the contract." "Not what?" she said. "But that's something." He nodded. He looked at her with the full, open quality that had replaced the sharpening by degrees of the previous winter. "Agnes Forsyth told me," she said, "that the object cannot lie. The person presenting it can." He was quiet for a moment. "And people," he said, "as a general principle, learn the difference," she said, "before the room does." They stood at the doorway of the restored wing in the October light, which was the same thin lateral light as the November before it, but warmer, and he reached out and took the handle of her carpet bag from her hand, gently, with the particular gentleness of someone performing a first gesture they have been considering for a long time, and she let him take it, and they walked together down the long corridor into the rest of the house. The silver vinaigrettes stood in their vitrine, their gilding restored to clarity. The bracket clock ticked with its 17th century mechanism, accurately labeled now, under its corrected date. The account book was gone from the shelf, to the investigator's archive where it belonged, and in its place was a correctly catalogued estate journal and a clean space where it had sat, which Cordelia had noted in the inventory as vacant, provenance documented, evidence retained. The small brass seal, her own, the one she used to mark her working copies as primary records in the hand of the practitioner of record, was in her coat pocket as it always was. She kept it there. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you will leave a word in the comments telling me where in the world you are hearing this, and what, if anything, it stirred in you, whether that is the particular patience of the work or the particular cost of overlooking someone who is simply better than you expect. I read every comment. If this kind of story is the kind you come back to, I would be glad if you stayed by subscribing, because there are more of them, each one made with the same care this one received. And I will leave you with this question to carry away. Have you ever been in a room, in your own life, where the truth was visible to anyone willing to look closely enough, and found yourself wondering why no one else was looking? That question, in the manner of all the questions that matter, had no single answer, but it had a texture, and the texture was the particular one of early morning in a room where someone else had already been working. Julian discovered this about Cordelia before he understood that it was significant. He would arrive at the East Wing on mornings when he told himself he was passing through on the way to some other part of the house, and he would find the door already open and her carpet bag already on the windowsill and her loupe already on the cord at her wrist, and the condition sheets already ordered on the table in the arrangement she preferred, which placed the most recent work at the top so that the progress of the survey was readable at a glance. He told himself for a number of weeks that he came to the wing to monitor progress. This was accurate in the way that many true statements are inaccurate. What he came to the wing to find was the quality of attention she brought to it, which was the kind of attention he recognized from his own discipline, applied to his own estate, by someone to whom the estate belonged in no legal sense and every other. He did not say this, He had not yet found the form of words in which it could be said without becoming something he was not ready to have become. He came one morning in May, the month before the commission was formally extended, and found her at the bookcase, which she had been reclassifying room by room since the investigators had removed the account book and left a vacancy in the sequence that needed addressing. She was working her way through the household journals, checking each against the estate's documentation, restoring the ones that had been pushed out of sequence by the hidden volume, and she was doing this with the steady, undemonstrative thoroughness with which she did everything, and she did not stop when he entered, and she did not look up, and she did not perform the small social adjustment that most people make when authority enters a room they are occupying, which was the removal of full concentration from the work and the division of it between the work and the authority, and he stood inside the door for longer than he had intended before she said, without turning, "The household records run correctly from 1832 through 1848, and then there is a gap of 14 months, and then they resume in 1850. "A gap," he said. "The volumes for those 14 months are not here. They may be in the muniments room. They may have been removed when the scheme required that the East Wing's contents appear uncomplicated." She turned then and looked at him directly. "It would be worth knowing what was acquired during those 14 months, and what was not." He nodded slowly. "I will have the muniments room searched. I have already identified the gap in the muniments inventory," she said. "The relevant box is labeled 1849, and it holds records from 1851. I set it aside." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him without the quality of watching that demands a response, but simply the quality of watching that is itself a form of patience. "You set it aside," he said. "In November." "In November," she agreed, and returned to the bookcase. This was the particular quality of the thing between them, that she did not require him to acknowledge the accumulation of her competence, and that his acknowledgment of it, when it came, was always slightly behind where she already was, and that neither of them found this an occasion for embarrassment. She had been there first. She would continue to be there first. And he had begun to understand that this was not a competition he had been enrolled in, but a fact of the landscape, and that the landscape was better for it. He left the wing that morning with the box she had set aside under his arm, and in it he found the 14 missing months, and in the missing months he found 3 further acquisitions by Croft of Bristol that the investigators had not seen, and he sent a rider to London with this information, and received back a letter of considerable formality and a measure of surprise at the existence of a further trail, and he brought the letter to Cordelia and placed it on her table, and said, 3 more. She read it. She did not say, "I expected as much," though she had. She said, "Then the final accounting will be accurate rather than approximate." He agreed that this was the better condition. They stood at the table in that east wing with the spring light, which was different again from the winter and the autumn light, warmer and more horizontal at the same time, the kind of light that enters a room and suggests that the room has been waiting for it. And what passed between them in that moment was not a declaration of any kind, but a settling, a shared recognition that the ground they were standing on had been cleared and leveled and was capable of bearing weight, and that they were both standing on it, and both aware of the other's presence there, and neither was pretending otherwise. Mrs. Gale observed all of this from the various positions she occupied in the course of her daily management of the house, and she said nothing, because she was a woman who understood that some processes conclude themselves more efficiently without commentary. Tobias Crane, when the final accounting was published and the figure of £3,460 was established as the corrected total, received the news in his corner of the ironmonger's shop with the same stillness with which he received most things, and said only, "Then it is settled." Fowler, behind the counter, said nothing, which was more or less what he always said, but in a different key. The restoration of the East Wing's documentation took 4 months from commission to completion. Cordelia worked through the summer on the cross-referencing of physical assessments against corrected provenance records, rebuilding the estate's catalog from the authentic objects outward, assigning each item its correct hallmark notation, its construction period, its acquisition history where it could be verified, and the clear notation unverified provenance where it could not, because the honest gap, she had learned from Agnes, was worth more than the confident error. She produced in the end a catalogue of 112 items in the East Wing, with full condition reports, provenance assessments, and recommended conservation notes, bound in the waxed linen thread she had finally obtained from a reliable London supplier, sealed with her small brass seal on the cover page, and signed in her plain hand on the attestation page as follows: Survey completed and attested by Cordelia Ashford, appraiser of estate contents, in the practice formerly of Agnes Forsyth, Wiltshire. She placed it on Julian Ashmore's desk on a Friday evening in late September, with the last of the day's light still in the room. He picked it up and held it in both hands for a moment without opening it, in the way a person holds something they understand to be complete before they begin to read it, because the completeness itself is a thing worth holding. "Is it all there?" he said. "Every object that is in that wing is in that catalogue," she said, "and everything that is in the catalogue is in that wing." He opened to the attestation page. He read her name, her title, her lineage, to Agnes Forsyth. He looked up at her, and there was in his face the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he had been approaching for a long time, and finds that it is not a conclusion at all, but an opening. "Stay," he said. It was 2 syllables doing the work of considerably more. She looked at him with the same steadiness she brought to everything, and what she permitted herself, which was not nothing, was a slight and irreversible shift in the quality of that steadiness, as though a window had been opened in a room that had been sealed for the winter, and the air that entered was the right temperature. "I have work to do here," she said. "You do," he said. Neither of them looked away. The silver vinaigrettes stood in their vitrine in the East Wing, 2 floors below, and the bracket clock kept its 17th century time in the quiet of the restored room, and the waxed linen binding of the completed catalogue rested between Julian's hands, and the October that would come was 1 week away, and the small brass seal was in her coat pocket, and she reached into her pocket and held it in her closed hand for a moment, not because she needed to, but because it was hers, and it was Agnes's, and it connected this moment to the workroom in Wiltshire and the woman who had sat in her chair beside the fire with the condition report and the pen and the small involuntary mark at the end, and it connected all of it to the aphorism written in the margin of the hallmarking tables that Cordelia had read so many times. She could no longer see it as words, but only as a principle, interior as breathing. The object cannot lie. The person presenting it can. Learn the difference before the room does. She had learned it. She had brought it here, into this hall, into this burned and dishonest and now restored and accurately documented room, and she had laid it out on a table in front of a man who had looked at it properly for the first time, and had not looked away. And that was the shape of things, and the shape was good, and she released the seal back into her pocket, and she said, "Show me where the morning light comes into the house." He did. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you will leave a word in the comments telling me where in the world you are hearing this, and what, if anything, it stirred in you, whether that is the particular patience of the work, or the particular cost of overlooking someone who is simply better than you expect. I read every comment. If this kind of story is the kind you come back to, I would be glad if you stayed by subscribing, because there are more of them, each one made with the same care this one received. And I will leave you with this question to carry away. Have you ever been in a room, in your own life, where the truth was visible to anyone willing to look closely enough, and found yourself wondering why no one else was looking?